Cool. Thanks for coming to today's session. I'll be talking about this particular topic, and I assume most people are probably interested. That's why they're here. And it's also kind of near and dear to me and my company, Metaphor. It's about scaling data governance. And it is, a pretty big topic. I will not attempt to try to solve all the things out there, but try my best to talk about how how we solve these for some of our customers, and how I solved this in the past for LinkedIn, and how I heard from talking to a bunch of data practitioners on how they're trying to solve it, or any success and value in solving those things. So hopefully it will be more like an experience sharing session than trying to pretend that I'm an expert in this area and trying to educate people here. So that's kind of the theme. So I'll start it off by first talking about what's data governance. I think a lot of you probably have some ideas of it, but it turns out that it's actually not a super straightforward thing to talk about or define. And I'll sort of break it down into some of the key aspects and components of data governance and talk about them in greater details about, what are the problems there and how do people solve it. And finally, I'll propose something that we think it's in the right direction of solving and scaling data governance for company big and small. So a little bit about myself first. I started the Metaphor Data about a year ago. I'm the CTO and co-founder of the company, and I'm also the co-creator of this fairly popular open source project called Data Hub. If you look at it by GitHub start, it's probably the most popular project out there in this particular area. And this thing was created when I was a tech lead for the metadata team at LinkedIn, solving all sorts of metadata related issues, including data governance there. So a lot of my thoughts and approach sort of influenced by my past experience working at LinkedIn and working in the open source community. So the interesting thing is, if you search data governance and for definition on Google, you're gonna get a lot of these long-winded explanations of what they are. Even Wikipedia doesn't do a good job of summarizing that in 1 or 2 sentences. And the funny thing is, if you read through all of those, you realize that they all seem to be talking about the same thing, but not quite. So the way I look at it is that's focused on, rather than the literal definition of things, but what's the end goal here, right? What's the common end goal that data governance is trying to bring? And those are the one that I highlighted here, right? How do you support business objective? How do you allow organization to reach its goals? How do organization manage and gain better control over their data assets? That's kind of the overarching goal of data governance, if you think about it. And there's multiple ways and multiple approach people are proposing how to do that. But ultimately, that's kind of this common goal that everybody's trying to achieve. And I took the liberty of synthesizing all that and summarizing into a very simple formula, which is people, process, and technology, with the end goal of better data for business, right? And this is actually quite important, because if you look at this, a lot of time, for us in the data world, a lot of time the first thing we think about is technology. Okay, what's a cool infrastructure out there? What's a cool product out there? And all that. How do those things help us, the tools and whatnot? But when it comes to governance, technology is only part of the solution, right? It's pretty much equal to the people involved in the process, the business process that put in place. Without those things, just technology alone is not going to solve this problem, unfortunately. And I'll get into greater details of why and how. But just bear that in mind. Right? This is not a pure technology problem. It's not about, hey, how do you build the most scalable system out there that solves all of that? But if you do not get the people right, if you do not have established the right process, you will not be able to solve this problem, unfortunately. Okay, so data governance is kind of an old thing. If you've been in the data industry for a while, then you have heard of this term over and over again, from a long time ago. On the other hand, the modern data stack is kind of the in thing now, right? Everybody's talking about it. Hey, we want to move to the modern data stack and all that. So let's take a look at how these two things play out. So when it comes to data governance, the first thing people tend to think about is, oh, this is a top-down process, right? There's some data governance team, generally very small, a couple of people across the company. They're trying to push down certain policies and processes from top down to the whole company. Certainly centralized, right? There's some central team that was ultimately in charge of pushing all these initiatives, putting policies in place and whatnot. There's also a lot of curation involved, right? Okay, a lot of this, think of this as well manicured garden sort of thing, right? This is like, okay, if you want to look at the whole company through this little lens, and then you only see the prettiest part of it, so to speak. So there's a lot of curation involved in data governance. And generally trying to present this homogeneous picture of how the company data landscape look like and works. That's data governance. On the other hand, modern data stack is almost the exact opposite if you think about it. There's a lot of stress on bottom-up adoptions, grassroots, tools and whatnot on that front. So it's all about, hey, people sort of really actually working on data. Those are the people who are trying to drive the direction of the modern data stack, right? It's certainly distributed. There's other hot terms that are being thrown around out there like data mesh and all that, right? It's all sort of around the same concept, saying that, hey, look, data is something that is a lot localized when people actually start using it, right? Every business unit, every teams and organization have very different goals in terms of what they want to achieve, right? And how a very different way of using the data. So it has to be a distributed thing, right? People across the company, not centralized into one small team. And also, it's one of sort of the fundamental principle of modern data stack is this democratization, right? You want to empower that as many people be able to use the power of data, democratizing all the tools and whatnot, right? So there's a big part of that, as opposed to everything being manicured, controlled, curated. And finally, modern data stack is also a big proponent of saying, hey, look, let's take the best of breed tools, right, from each part of the stack and then just put them together so you get the best system at the end of the day, rather than saying, hey, look, there's going to be one homogeneous system that everybody aligned to. It was rather, hey, that's just make it heterogeneous by nature, but through that we can get the best out of the stack. So the biggest problem is this even compatible? If you look at the two, right? Does that mean if you adopt modern data stack, you have to throw away your data governance? Or if you have a strong data governance, you have to throw away your modern data stack? Are these two things even compatible? So a good analogy of this, we face this pretty much every day. And you'll probably get it immediately when I show you the picture, which is driving. Probably we do less of it now in the pandemic, but still, we're very familiar with this whole system here, right? If you think about it, this is a completely distributed system, right? Every driver has their own mind when it comes to driving their car, right? It's definitely not curated in any sense, right? It's definitely something, and cars, the different in size and speed and all that is definitely heterogeneous in that sense. And there's no top-down thing, right? There's not like one person trying to control all the cars or a few person trying to control all the cars. But somehow it works most of the time, right? And the reason behind that is we have rules, right? Very simply, there's lane that people have to follow, there's signal lights people have to follow, right? People indicate when they change lane and all that. There's a bunch of rules that we put in place to make sure that even though people are trying to get to their end destination as quickly as possible, we don't end up having car accident every day, right? All the time. And these rules are essentially data governance, if you think about it. These are the things that we put down and we agree on, hey, these are good things. These are things that will help us as a whole to move faster. But it doesn't prevent people from, it doesn't completely control everybody and say, hey, look, this is, you still have a lot of freedom about where you want to go and how fast you want to drive and all that, but within certain limit, within certain rules. So this is a great example of, how do you apply data governance in the so-called modern data stack nowadays? You have to have certain basic rules and principles in place to make sure that the whole company move in the same direction, in a good direction. You don't end up with complete organic, chaotic situation. Okay, so there's several aspects of data governance. Like I said in the beginning, I won't be able to cover all of them, but these are the one that we feel like they're pretty key, near and dear to us, and then also very important part of the data governance. So one of the key aspects is data availability, right? And if you really look deeper into that, that kind of means I should have the ability to find the data that I need, and it's available there for me to use. Okay, so you can say that's more or less synonymous to search and discovery of data. The second aspect is data usability. Okay, so sure, you find the stuff. Okay, you found the stuff that you think you're looking for, but how do I actually use it, right? So that's the data usability aspect of it. And if you think about it, that kind of really just related to knowledge, right? Okay, you find the stuff, but you need to have the knowledge around it on, hey, how do I actually even use it? So the second aspect of data usability, we sort of summarize, we sort of equate that to knowledge. And the third aspect, you probably heard this term being thrown around quite a lot as well, data stewardship, right? But the more general concept of it is kind of this whole very vague idea about ownership, right? Okay, so who's really ultimately responsible for what when it comes to this data? That is also a very key aspect of data governance. And data security is one of the most very important part of data governance, obviously. You want to make sure that you have good access control in place, and we'll get into why that is the case and what are the driving factors behind it and how to do it. But that's kind of, and then there's obviously there's also other aspects of such as, encryptions and, protections and all that sort of stuff. But generally the thing that we're focusing here is kind of like, okay, how do you grant access in the right way to people, right? So you don't hamper them, but then at the same time, you don't just let anyone access everything. And the data quality is also a big part of it. Once again, you can generalize to kind of the whole observability. Once again, this is also kind of a hot area right now. How do you know that you have the data that you're supposed to have, right? And then, when something breaks, you want to be able to have that immediate visibility into that something is not working as expected. So if you're kind of familiar with, these fields here, you might actually jump to the conclusions. Hey, look, I know one thing that solves a lot of these things. And I've definitely heard that before, which is data catalog, right? At least for the first 3 points, that's kind of the bread and butter of any data catalog. When it comes to security and quality, some people might have concern over that, but the first 3 sounds like it's a data catalog problem, right? So does that mean that that's a solution? Can we just throw data catalog at the problem and say, hey, look, I just need to have a data catalog and all my data governance problem is solved? We'll look at that later. So the first thing I want to cover is search and discovery. And, I kind of spoiled by showing the picture there already, but it is actually, widely agreed upon that finding the right data is hard, right? The emphasis is on right data here, not just any data, right? This is kind of an, semi-oldish survey that's done in the past where, it's saying that the people like data scientists and, business analysts, they spend about 20% of their time finding the data that they need in order to do the actual analysis, which takes less than 20%, right? So, and then this, boils down to, okay, is this a ranking problem? Is it because we have no magical Google search like experience that you can just type into a box and say, hey, I'm looking for this type of data, XYZ, and then just magically get what you need? Is that where the problem is? We don't really think so. Yes, you can certainly rank, all these data assets by certain aspect, right? A lot of signal might be relevant, okay, how often is this used, how many people depends on it and all that. But what we found out over the years is that it's not a pure search problem per se. It's not a pure search ranking problem per se. Because a lot of time when people are looking for things, they're not necessarily looking for something that is, following the norm, so to speak. Yes, certainly when you're looking for the, dashboard for, your KPI, right? Your earning, your customers counts and whatnot. Sure, you can probably deduce good signal to rank that problem. But when you're looking for something that are less popular or that's only used by your team or it's only relevant to your business use case and whatnot, your traditional rankings sort of fall apart at that point. And even if, say, that you have some way of magically ranking everything so you're able to find the stuff you need, there's also a huge trust issue here. What we heard a lot from people is saying that, okay, sure, I found the things that I supposed to be looking for, but the first thing is like, is this the right thing? Right? Still, people when they find it, they still have all these questions. And then if you really look deeper into that and say, okay, so how do you know? And how, when you look at something, how do you know this is the stuff that you're looking for? People ask these sort of questions, right? Okay, well, first thing I want to know is how was this thing even created, right? What's the source, right? Where did it come from, right? And then, what's the transformation used there, right? I mean, if I'm looking for sales data, did this actually come from Salesforce, right? Ultimately. So there's definitely that part of the question. Okay, they help people to rule out that this is not even the right thing to look for. And oftentimes people want to say, oh, when was this last refreshed, right? Is this frequently refreshed? If it's not, maybe it's a dead data set. Nobody care about it. Nobody's using it. It was created ad hocly at one point and no one's maintaining it. And, if you're getting deeper into it, people say, okay, I want to see the shape of the data, right? Okay, what kind of distribution on that day? What's the min and max? Does it even make sense for my use case? And another big question people tend to ask is, okay, well, I need to see documentation, right? I mean, just showing me that, this is the data set and this is, these are the columns. And even if you show me the type of the columns and whatnot, that's not enough for me to know that this is the thing I'm looking for, right? I want to see some solid documentation saying that, hey, look, if I'm doing use case XYZ, this is the data set to use. But most interesting of all is when we talk to a lot of people, the first thing we heard is, spare me all the technical detail, right? You can give me all that, which is good. And that's all kind of secondary. But a lot of time, I'll trust the data if someone I trust is using the data, right? And this might sound very non-technical, but that's actually the reality at the ground, right? Where people say, hey, look, if I see someone that I know, is a power user, or someone who's an expert in this area that is using or depending on this data, then I have a lot of more trust in saying that this is the right one, right? And then either I go and talk to that person, or I dig further into the sort of secondary information and say, okay, now is this really something that I can use? But without getting those human factor into place, and they're just purely throwing like these sort of technical information to people, a lot of time will not really get the trust that you wanted. So once again, coming back to the data governance story again, people is a very important part of this whole aspect. It's not a pure technology problem per se, because we as humans, we still tend to trust people that we trust more than we trust what the system tells us. And then the second part of search and discovery is discovery, right? A lot of people are trying to solve the search problem, saying that, hey, look, let's just index everything and then just present them to the user, right? But then there's also a big interesting aspect of finding data through discovery, okay? And what does that mean? Well, you have no doubt seen this recommendation thing popping up in all sorts of different websites, right? Amazon was famous for having the customer who bought this also bought XYZ, right? That sort of recommendation is actually very powerful. Once again, people, a lot of time, because of their job and the nature of the job and organizations and all that, they tend to cluster into certain, closely related groups, right? Organically. So if you're using this, if your team is using this, then chances are you're probably gonna also need to use it. So having that recommendation is a good way of helping people to find related things, so to speak. And obviously, if you have some way of curating lists, that's obviously, and people are sort of doing that already, right? Where, team sometimes may have wiki and say, hey, look, these are the 10 things that we use all the time. Or if you're doing this type of analysis, these are the 5 things you should use, right? So having some curated list is another way of discovering. And sometimes you discover through lineage, right? This is in the sense of you're looking at something and you say, okay, let me look at the upstream of this thing and then downstream of this thing, who's feeding into this and who's using this. And then through that, you discover related data assets. And like I mentioned sort of briefly before, the whole team and organizational aspect of it is definitely a very strong signal for discovering things, right? Whatever your team is using or whatever your organization is using likely is something that you'll be interested in as well. And finally, sometimes you want to discover through people, right? So, this is almost natural that, in teams that where you have, in certain domain, you have experts that are pretty well known because they've done a lot of things in this area. Generally, you want to start with those people and say, hey, what are those people using and how are they doing their analysis as a way of discovering other things as well. Once again, coming back to the same people aspect of this thing, right? So that's a good way of discovering as well. And something a little bit more organic, right? If something is trending, right? A lot of people start using this, or a lot of people start talking about this topic, right? A lot of momentum is gaining on this particular projects and whatnot. These are things that can also help you to discover, right? For example, you're working on project, XYZ, and then you found out that hey, someone else is also working on that or in different aspect of it. That is a way of discovering, related stuff as well. So in summary, when it comes to search and discovery, you can think of it as containing sort of 3 key components that you need to satisfy all of them to really give people a good search and discovery experience, right? Obviously, you need a technical metadata, right? These are things basically define what the data assets is, right? What the schema, the lineage, the SQL code that ran to create it, what's the data quality, and all these things sort of around, sort of factual things about the assets you're looking at that can be sort of automatically gathered from the system itself. These, we call them just technical metadata. These things that you should definitely present these to the user. But like we sort of touched on before, the business metadata is also very important, right? A lot of people looking at this is like, okay, how is this ultimately relating to the business objective I'm trying to achieve, right? I mean, I'm trying to do analysis on, churn rates and whatnot, right? So having that bridge of saying, hey, look, this table plus that table or this column in this table represent what kind of business, concepts and whatnot. This is also super important. And finally, behavior metadata, right? These are things that like, the who, where, and how is this thing being used, right? These are things that when people are running query, building notebook, all of these things sort of, or viewing, on the system and all that, these are sort of things that eventually forms a behavior, right? And then this is also super helpful from the sense of people to know, oh, is really anyone actually using the things? When it comes to that, you can think of cases, hey, look, if I want to deprecate things, right? This is super important, valuable information. And then it needs to be included as part of the search and discovery experience. The second aspect I want to touch on is knowledge. And this is kind of a broad topic as well. But it's actually turned out to be also one of the biggest pain points in a lot of companies, right? For better, for worse, most of the companies, when it comes to data, they're kind of bad at keeping the knowledge or capturing the documentation, right? But if you think about it, there's multiple ways people are doing it today. Certainly a group of people will be a strong proponent of saying, oh, just put everything in code, right? Comment, description, whatnot, this could be like DBT models, whatnot, right? People would say, hey, look, all the documentation should be checked into code. That's how, software engineer has done it for years. Other disciplines should follow as well, right? And that is obviously a very most well-maintained way of keeping the documentation. But it also has a very high bar because it sort of requires you to have some sort of engineering background in order to do that. The next level of things, well, we're all familiar with this wiki, Notion, docs that people keep around. This is certainly happening everywhere, and the reason, it's pretty obvious. People just feel like that's the lowest bar, right? They can easily create a wiki page, Notion page, and whatnot. There's not a lot of barrier to get into that. But it has its downside as well. Of course, we all kind of know that almost, any document or wiki page that you create, by definition, start going outdated as soon as it's created. And then people are generally very, don't keep these things up to date. So it was good for one point, and then very quickly it became misleading. But still, it's being written down. So there's still some records of it. Then a lot of information actually happens in email and Slack, right? People generally just ask other people, and then they send messages in channels or direct message or send email directly. And a lot of knowledge is actually being captured in that form. Once again, the barrier is even lower, right? You don't even have to, write, do some good writing in wiki or create a table or whatnot. You just send people a message. Right? The barrier is a lot lower even. But then, of course, the discovery or search or finding all these knowledge becomes extremely hard because the noise becomes very, very high at that point. And then we've certainly seen a lot of people, especially when it comes to like data scientists or business analysts, they a lot of time they just keep local files. Right? They have a text file that basically have SQL snippet, or maybe they have a notebook or whatnot, right? And then, or maybe they open up their query console and then just keep queries in there so they can keep running and all that. That is obviously very easy to do, but then at the same time, none of that is exposed in any way, right? Because generally people don't index their local files, and the search console is private to them and all that. So these information definitely is not shared with anybody at all. But then actually the worst part of it is majority of the knowledge around data actually is in people's head. And here's a example showing that, right? All the things that are written down, with the records of it, these explicit knowledge is really the icebergs above the water, right? The majority of it is actually hidden. And when people leave, change team, and over time they forget and all that, all these tribal knowledge eventually get lost. And someone will have to basically pay the price again of rediscovering it, going through the same, jumping through the same, falling into the same trap and jumping through the same hoops in order to eventually accumulate all these knowledge again. So you can take a look at these knowledge and then sort of further broken them down into different types of knowledge, right? And then a lot of times this is sort of eventually is what's you're trying to achieve in terms of knowledge, is to communicate that with people. You want to let people know that this is the case, and that person could be you in the future, but a lot of times it's someone else on the teams or in other teams. So the first type of category of knowledge is, data producer trying to communicate with data consumer, right? So these things are like, okay, table, column descriptions, right? Okay, I import it, I create a new table, I create a new column. I want to add some description to it. Things that are more formal, like KPI, metric definition, right? I'm trying to deprecate something, right? I'm trying to let people know that, hey, don't use this, start using that. That is also a very important piece of knowledge. Or, something happened, right? Okay, the pipeline was broken, right? Or maybe, there was some incidents upstream and we lost all the data for this day or whatever. These sort of things is also very important to record it down somewhere. So, someone in the future will come and use this, will realize, oh, okay, these are the things I need to be aware of because there was some incident that just, we can never recover from, or we just have to work around it. Okay. So if you look at this categories of knowledge, mostly from producer to consumer, you actually want these knowledge or information being highly governed in a sense, right? You wouldn't think that, someone from the company, random Joe from the company, will be able to go in there and then start changing the KPI metrics definition for the whole company, right? That would be wrong, right? Or someone who didn't produce a table to go in and start talking about the table descriptions and all that also seems wrong as well. So these knowledge has to be governed, and generally there's only a few people, most likely data team or whatever the central team that you have there, that controls these information and make sure that they're well kept, very well up to date. So the second set of knowledge is the opposite direction, right? The consumer is trying to communicate something to the producer. They don't know that, hey, look, be aware of these things, right? Because I'm your consumer. This is different from producer to consumer. You have to crowdsource this essentially, right? Because your consumer is generally the whole company or big swaths of the company, and then they change from time to time. So you kind of have to crowdsource all these knowledge. And then the things that we talk about is mostly about dependency, right? Okay, the consumer is trying to tell the producer, say, hey, look, this is something that depends on heavily, so don't do anything to it, right? Or if you want to change anything, please let me know. That sort of communication is critical from consumer to producer. And then the final kind of knowledge is between the consumer themselves, right? Once again, this is obviously has to be crowdsourced. It's not you don't expect this to be highly governed, but the kind of knowledge we're talking about here is use cases, right? Okay, if you want to do analysis, this type of analysis, you should take this table, join with that table, or you should look at this particular dashboard because that's the dashboard that the exec look at every day or something like that, right? These sort of things, the consumer is trying to tell other consumer, hey, look, this is how you do it, right? Or even more explicitly, they provide example queries, or this is the way to you filter the things and all that, right? These things you don't want them to be governed because these things are very fluid by its nature, right? Things change over time, and then the central data team or data engineering generally don't care about these sort of things in reality, right? They care that there's a use case that's being used and all that, but they don't really care the nitty-gritty details about those use cases. That's not their charter, so to speak. So you definitely want to make sure this is sort of crowdsourced rather than governed. And then finally, this is trying to echo what I said previously. One of the biggest problems with knowledge is how do you make sure that it's accurate, and how do you make sure that people actually go and use it and create it, right? So one of the key concepts that we truly believe in is if the knowledge is not being created within the existing workflow, they will be very hard to push people to create it. Wiki will be a perfect example, right? The reason why Wiki, the barrier to write a wiki is high and try to maintain it is high because it's generally outside of your normal workflow, right? And then when people say, hey, check document into code, why does that work? Because it's part of your Git workflow. So yeah, when you change your code, you change documentation. Right? So ultimately, if the creation of these knowledge is not within your normal workflow, chances are people just wouldn't be bothered to create it, especially if the information is not so formal and then the usefulness of it is limited to a small group. Most of the time, people just say, oh, I can't be bothered. Right? But it's not just the creation part of it, right? These knowledge need to also surface at the place where you are actually doing work. Once again, Wiki is also not great for this particular case, or Notion Page is not particularly great for this case, because you're doing something in some tools, or your IDEs, or some web apps and whatnot. You have to explicitly jump that out and go to a separate place to look for that information, the relevant information, right? Assuming you can even find the information in the first place. It'll be a lot more natural for these relevant knowledge and information to surface directly within your current workflow, right? Imagine a case of, hey, some data scientists or business analysts writing something in a notebook, for example. And then as they write out in the notebooks, automatically something pop up and say, hey, look, you're trying to join this table, be careful, this is being deprecated. Or, hey, look, you're depending on this thing that maybe you should look at that thing instead, right? So surfacing that information within the existing workflow will make it a lot more useful than just having some other place for people to go and look up the information. And also super important here is the whole lifecycle management, right? Creating information, even if you make it easy, using it, even if you make it easy. But if the knowledge itself is not up to date, it's not being maintained, then you might as well not have knowledge in the first place. In fact, it can be harmful at times where you're looking at old information that's already outdated and guide you down the wrong path. Right? And once again, how do you do the thing in a way that you make sure that people actually go and do it, right? I think most people have great intention of saying, hey, look, some documentation here, I want to keep it up to date. Most of the time they don't do that. It's not because they're lazy, it's just that they even forgot this thing exists in the first place, right? They wrote it once and then 3 months later, they forgot that they even wrote it and written it in the first place. Or they wrote it and say, oh, that was useful at the time, nobody probably needs it afterwards, so they can't be bothered to go and update it. So how do you have a way, this feedback where people are able to tell you, say, hey, look, this information might be outdated, I need it, can you help me to make sure that it is still up to date? And then make that whole process super easy for the person who created that knowledge to be able to, approve it, validate it, or update it. That is critical in maintaining the quality of the knowledge and making sure they don't go stale. And finally, when you are awash with a lot of knowledge, how do you know which one is the relevant one, right? Especially if you have conflicting information or you just end up with too much related information. A lot of time also boil down to social signal, right? Think of it as your LinkedIn feed or Facebook feed and whatnot, right? I mean, they do a great job of surfacing information that are very relevant to you. But a lot of time that relevance just essentially comes from your connections, right? If your connections, liking the thing a lot, chances are you probably like it. Once again, this sort of clustering effect, essentially. So having ability for people to say, hey, look, I think this is good knowledge that other people will find useful and all that. That is also super important when it comes to this knowledge management. All right, so the next topic is ownership. Okay, this one is a super interesting one because it's being talked about so many times, and the word ownership itself is overloaded in so many ways that kind of need to sort of demystify it a little bit. So the typical problem, question people like to ask is, who's the owner, right? But what do they really mean by that? Right? Are they talking about the data engineering team? Should that be should the team or someone else from that team should be the owner? Are they talking about the ETL pipeline author, right? Are they talking about the analytics engineer who wrote the DBT model? Are they talking about the data scientist who's using it? Are they talking about the business analyst who has dashboard that depends on this? Or are they even talking about the business stakeholder that ultimately uses data, right? Any one of them could be an owner, depending on how you interpret the word owner, right? And then the other way to look at it is, okay, instead of looking at who are the possible type of owner, you can look at the type of assets you're talking about, right? Maybe that will help you as well. So if you look at raw table, you say, okay, raw table, maybe that means whoever wrote the ETL pipeline and all that, that seems like the reasonable people because those are the only people who touch the thing, right? If you look at core tables, maybe you're thinking, okay, maybe it's an analytics engineer who built up the facts and dimension tables and all these things. And if you talk about derived tables, you may say, oh, that's probably the analyst, or maybe it's the data scientist who derive things. And then if you look at BI model, you can suddenly say, okay, those are those select analysts who build the BI models, right? Looker views, explores, and whatnot that everybody else depends on. Or maybe you look at dashboards, so that should be pretty straightforward. Whoever created dashboard is probably the owner. And KPI metric definition, as we touched on previously, these probably belong to a very small group of people in the company that controls it and defining it and driving the definition. The way we look at it is you kind of have to break this down once again into two groups of information roughly. One is this concept of governed ownership, right? Okay. So this sort of generally fall into the sort of data SIE kind of owner, right? These are people maintaining the pipeline infra and then the actual code, they're doing the transformations and whatnot. When something breaks, these are the people who they're looking for, right? Essentially say, hey, these are the owner because they own the pipeline broke it. So we're gonna go and pick these people. Generally, this sort of boils down to a team, right? If it's in a slightly bigger company, in a small company, it might be a couple of individuals who are, in charge of these things. But the information here is mostly static, right? It's not like you have, the whole company building the pipeline, right? It'll be just a very small select group of people who are sort of in charge of bringing the data in and doing the initial massaging of it and whatnot. So that's why this is a governed ownership in that sense, right? These are the ownership that, once again, do not change very much and shouldn't change very much. And when they change, you definitely want to make sure that it is managed in a way that it is accurate, so people can actually find these people when something really broken. And the other kind of ownership is this crowdsource ownership, right? What do I mean by that? Generally, it sort of boils down to SMEs, right? Think of it when someone say, "Oh, who's the owner of this data?" Right? A lot of time they're referring to who has the most knowledge about this data, because their immediate next question is, "I want to ask that person how to use it," right? And that person generally is not the data team, right? Unless you're talking about the real core table. It generally is, some power user in particular business functions and units and whatnot. These are the people who use the data directly to drive dashboards and whatnot. They know, or data scientists who build machine learning models. These are people who know the content of the data very well, right? They may not own the pipeline that create these things in the first place, but they use this thing and they know the thing inside out. So these are the domain experts, so to speak. And these are generally individuals, right? Like I said, power user in certain business functions and units and whatnot. And it's somewhat fluid in the sense that people, change, right? Change team, change projects and all that. These ownership is not like it's constant, right? I mean, as things evolve, who used to be an SME is now passing on to someone else and all that. And by that very nature, that's why this ownership has to be crowdsourced. It cannot be, you cannot have a very heavy governance process here, making sure that only certain people get to assign other people to become owner. All right. So the next thing I'll talk about is access control. Once again, the whole security area is a big area. I'm particularly focusing on this aspect of access control. And, it's pretty apparent that the biggest driver for this is to do with compliance. And all these famous and not so famous privacy law, some cover a huge geographic area, some are very specific to local, is a huge driving force behind this, right? And then, I think this news just came out recently that it turns out that the whole GDPR was pretty profitable for EU. And I think that's basically just tell you that other countries and other regions will definitely try to follow suit and push more on this front. So this is here to say it's not going anywhere. But it sort of boils down to this particular point, right? All of these privacy protection laws and access control law is basically saying that, hey, you want to make sure that people access data with the correct business justification. Right? In the old days, a lot of companies actually have this free-for-all model where, hey, anyone can access any data all the time. Right? In the more traditional industry, or the more highly regulated industry, banking, security, insurance, and whatnot, they have the other extreme where nobody have any access to data. If you want access to data, you have to file a request. Someone had to manually review your request and approve it. Of course, this whole manual approval process will most likely be very compliant, but then at the same time, that's basically a huge speed bump for anyone who want to do anything. I heard some horror story where people have to file these data access requests, wait for months and get the request approved, and then realize that it's not the right data, and they have to go and file another request. You can imagine how much productivity drain that would have been. So you don't want either extreme, right? You don't want, all right, any cowboy can access anything, but at the same time, you don't want complete stifle. So what's the balance to strike here? So I think in the old days, yeah, it's kind of an ACO list, right? Okay, everyone, if you're on the list, you get access to it. If you don't, you don't. But very quickly, people realize that it's not maintainable, right? Because if you have 1 million assets, you have 1 million ACO, who's going to manage all that, right? And then we sort of evolve into this role-based access control, right? Okay, we're saying, okay, well, if you're a data scientist, then that probably means you should have access to all of these 1,000 data set, right? So think of it as a group thing, right? So if you're part of this group, then you have access to things. And if you're part of that group, you have access to those things. But once again, someone still have to kind of manually maintain this group to asset mapping, right? And once again, the problem there is, most people get added onto a list or group and then never get removed, right? Because it just, nothing and then when the data changes, the actual grouping will not necessarily reflect that as well. So the latest iteration of this is policy-based access control, right? Or some people call this attribute-based access control or whatnot. But it kind of boils down to saying that, hey, look, let's take a look at the nature of the data, right? What kind of data is this? This is a PII data, right? If it's PII, does it actually contain credit card number or super sensitive information, personal information, or is it just like people's name, right? And then you have these policy written around it and say, hey, we want only certain people, fitting these criteria have access to data that looks like this. So that way is a lot more maintainable because now essentially you say, hey, look, you go and describe what that kind of data we're talking about, then the policy will automatically apply. But it's still not foolproof because there's still the describing what the data is sort of problem there, right? But then the idea is that probably is a lot more trackable than try to maintain all these groups or policies in the first place. And then this is also another interesting angle with access control. Sometimes it's not about binary. It's not like you have access or you don't have access, right? Sometimes we want to give you access, but then we want to make sure that we don't give you all access to everything. Some of the stuff will mask it out. Right? You can read it, but I'm not going to show you the SSN, right? All the SSN will be trimmed down to the last 4 digits or give you random SSNs or whatnot, right? So these sort of data masking is another angle. And then once again, this can be tied to the policy-based access control. Right? You can say, hey, look, if they're accessing, if you are not part of this group and you're accessing it, well, we're going to give you access, but we're going to mask out all these columns. And then all of that sort of boils down to this data tagging, right? Like I mentioned, someone need to go in there and then describe what kind of data it is, right, ultimately, in order for the policy engine to even work in the first place. And this is actually a very interesting question because, should this be governed or should this be crowdsourced? Right? You would think if you have a lot of data assets, maybe crowdsource is the right way to do it. But then at the same time, if compliance is on the line, you probably want us to be governed, right? So, but then does the central team of 3 know everything about all the data assets? The answer is no. Would they be the right person to actually approve or disapprove some tagging? Probably not. So this becomes an interesting question. And what we found is a lot of time you basically have to follow the sort of the best practice in coding, which is peer review, right? The peer is generally the best person to basically say, hey, look, I think this is the right way to tag it, or this is not the right way to tag it. And then on top of that, you will have some sort of fail-safe, right? Some data scanner profile and say, oh, wait, based on the profile of this data or based on the content of this thing, I think this is the right tagging. Right? So you kind of need to have that combination of sort of human review versus, and then machine learning or ML-based way of helping you to correctly tag the data and eventually allow people to access it based on the certain policy that you put in place. Okay, I think this is the last aspect, which is to do with observability. Okay, and you can look at it from this particular angle, which is it's kind of like unit tests for data if you think about it, right? Most of the data quality problem boils down to this, right? Either you're missing the data in the first place, or maybe the data arrived late, or maybe it's duplicates, right? Or maybe the format is inconsistent, right? Some of them is in date format, some of them in ISO format, right? Different type, or maybe it's all caps versus all lower cases. These sort of nuanced format changes a lot of time breaks your script as a result. Or maybe the row was just wasn't complete in the first place. You have a lot of null in there for whatever reason. The upstream was broken. Or maybe just the data just doesn't make sense, right? Maybe the zip code and the state doesn't even match up. Right? This is a lot more nuance in that sense. And there's also another type of thing to do with observability is abnormality detection. Right? This is a little bit more advanced where people say, hey, look, I don't need to write any tests. I just magically trust some system will be able to tell me if an anomaly was detected in my data. Right, but these things sort of look at it from a slightly higher level, right? They look at the volume, the freshness, and distribution, right? And if any of those does not conform to the previous norm, then you flag it. Some of these are rule-based, some of these are machine learning-based. But ultimately, it leads to some sort of alert, right? A Slack notification, emails, pages get flagged. And then once you've found out something is wrong, right? This is actually also very important, is you want to be able to analyze what's the actual impact, right? And then that's basically boiled down to running the lineage to your downstream, right? So if you know this particular table, there's some problem with the data, guess what? If the pipeline has already, if you didn't stop the pipeline in time and the pipeline actually ran, all the downstream pipeline ran, then this error basically get propagated to all your downstream. So you need to have a way of, analyzing that and say, okay, all these are all the downstream that were impacted by this particular change. And I want to be able to maybe rerun the pipeline once this problem is fixed to make sure that they get the latest data. Or, more basically, how do you even tell people, right? Okay, beware, something is broken here, don't trust the data, the data will be late for a day or something like that. How do you even know who to contact? You kind of need to rely on this whole downstream lineage analysis plus the ownership that we mentioned before to be even able to know who to tell. Right? You don't want to post this to the whole company email list every time when something goes wrong. Right? And there's a bunch of vendors out there that's sort of trying to tackle this area. As you can see, it's also a pretty hot area right now. So there are many solutions out there. Some are open source and some are proprietary. Yeah. All right, let's come to the last part of my talk is, so given all of that, how do you scale data governance, right? I think there's probably a theme that's emerging at this point you can start seeing now is, it's, first of all, it's kind of a balance you have to strike. Once again, going back to that, cars driving on road example I gave, right? You cannot be so restricted that nobody able to ride or to drive at all. You say everybody have to drive 5 miles per hour. Nobody able to get to where they want to in time, right? But then at the same time, you cannot have no rules in place at all and just say, hey, you can drive whichever way you want. And that certainly will lead to accidents down the track. And there's a bunch of things we cover here, right? Knowledge, search and discovery, definition of things, compliance, observability, ownership, lineage, tagging. What's the common thread across all of that, right? And how do you make sure that you're able to tackle all of these things at once? From our opinion, the founding thing that sort of support all of that, the foundation of that is metadata. If you think about it, all of that is essentially information or context around the actual data. Right? And you want to be able to bring all of that up so people can find the things that they want or trust the thing that they found or make sure that they are adhering to the compliance or tag things the right way and so on and so forth. So we're trying to propose this new concept of, hey, you kind of need to have a metadata platform in order to solve your data governance problem effectively. And we had a modern spin to that as well, called modern metadata platform. And I'll get into what that means a little bit as well. But essentially, it's not just a data catalog problem, right? It's not like you have a UI somewhere where people can find things and then just call that a day. Because there are other use cases that are, maybe programmatic driven or maybe report oriented and whatnot, that is not really suited for just a UI per se. Right? So on the one hand, you want to bring in all these metadata from various different systems, and then the scale of that can be very large. And on the other hand, you want to be able to keep supporting additional data governance initiative you want to push, right, and so on. So you need to have a platform in place, and that's where we think sort of the key ingredient to solving or scaling data governance in companies. So I'll briefly talk a little bit about what we think makes a metadata platform modern. We recently published another blog post on our website that talks this in greater detail. So here I will just spare the details and jump into some of the key points here. So the first thing is scalability and reliability. If you're thinking about a traditional data catalog, you'd be like, okay, how many people is really gonna use it in the company? Maybe 1,000 people, right? They're probably not gonna be accessing them at the same time all the time. So, the sort of traffic you have to scale to is probably minuscule, right? And then, these people are mostly just reading stuff, consuming information there, maybe occasionally add information. So once again, your backend doesn't need to be super scalable in that sense, right? And then because these are human, right, and it's used primarily Monday to Friday, and you don't really need to have 24/7 uptime in this case. So if it's a data catalog that you're talking about here, it doesn't need to be scalable and reliable, to be honest. And actually, a lot of companies have already attempted to build this one way or the other in their own in-house, right? Because it's not too hard to build something that is not scalable and reliable. It's not too hard to build a web app at the end of the day. But if you look at all the data governance initiative, a lot of those things boil down to programmatic access as well. Right? Think of the cases when an access control system is trying to grant access to someone, right? It needs to know what kind of data it is at that point, right? Or maybe there's some automatic data masking system that we talk about, right? All of that needs to happen at data access speed. Right? So you need a system that's very reliable, and then sometimes not even human driving in the first place, maybe system driving in the first place, right? You might have policy saying that, hey, look, you're only allowed to move PII data from this place to that place. Anything else should be dropped. Or maybe you say, hey, look, this pipeline should not run because of data observability issues and whatnot, right? So all of that thing is programmatic access and pipeline driven and all that. And when you get to that sort of state, then you better have a very scalable and reliable system. Right? But fortunately, this is not a super hard problem. Right? I mean, with most of the consumer internet technology, we know how to build scalable and reliable system and platform. That's not a super hard problem per se. The second thing that we feel like it's key ingredient for modern metadata platform is extensibility. Right? And this is important in the sense that for company to drive their own data governance initiative, it's unavoidable that at some point they will have to push their proprietary stuff. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all data governance that everybody will be able to adopt to it. And when you hit those things, then you'll face a choice of storing custom metadata that are specific to the company. And if your metadata platform is not able to easily extend the thing that it stores and serves, then it becomes a problem, right? And there's some interesting challenge there where some platform might choose to just store everything as blob. Right? Okay, you just throw me a JSON, I'll store it, and I'll give you back a JSON. Right? That is a way to get around the customizability. But then at that point, the API is kind of very hard to use, right? Because you just don't know what to expect in that JSON, and you don't know whether that JSON is valid or not. Right? So how do you have a system that has an easy to use API, but at the same time is also extendable? It's an interesting challenge. But we do believe that is an important aspect of the modern metadata platform. And then speaking of APIs, we also believe that, unlike your normal microservices where you say, hey, it's gonna be REST and that's just gonna be enough for most use cases. For a metadata platform, we also see there's other query patterns that people want to satisfy. There's a lot of graphical relationship that you want to traverse. I think of lineage will be a great example where you want to traverse this lineage graph to up and down the stream. You kind of need to have a more graphical oriented API. Just keep calling REST after REST REST call after REST call is not the most intuitive way to program things. So GraphQL is something that obviously very well adopted in the industry, and it's a good way to describe graph-oriented API calls as well. So we feel like that style of API is also super important. And also a lot of time there's event-driven things, right? For example, if someone break the rule, or if the, for example, the tagging of a data, it has been changed, right? Or maybe something go out of compliance, right? All these things kind of requires a sort of cascade of event to happen, right? You don't want to sit around and wait for 24 hours until some pipeline wakes up to figure out, oh, something changed, I need to take something. You kind of want to take action immediately at that point. So when that happens, you want to have an API way to actually push to you, right? Whether it's some sort of webhook or some event bus or whatnot, you want to be able to get that immediate feedback. And, oh, okay, I need to take an action now. Sort of reactive programming rather than busy poll or just check it once in a while, sort of API. And then finally, what a lot of people sort of overlook in terms of API is this analytical API. When it comes to data governance, especially, a lot of time you want to have that global view of things, right? You want to say, oh, are we all good, right? I mean, who's accessing what, right? I mean, over 30 days, did anyone access this thing, all right? Or, does everything have a data tag applied to it? What are the ones that are not? But you want to have that global view of the data ecosystem. And then generally you want a more analytical way of doing it. I think of it as almost like a mini data warehouse, essentially, right? You want to be able to run these query against all your metadata and say, oh, did some global constraint or rules was met here. So you need that sort of analytical API as well that allows you to run queries without bogging down your entire system. But I think the most important part that defines a modern metadata platform is it has to be very easy to integrate. Every company companies tend to have somewhat similar but not exactly the same sort of data stack, right? And then once again, the modern data stack sort of enable that as well. People just say, hey, I want to take the best of breed, right? And then I don't take one unified system. I want to take the best data warehouse. I want to take the best transform layer. I want to take the best BI, whatever that best means to my company. So you have this heterogeneousness in every company that you want to be able to easily integrate your system into your metadata platform, right? And then sometimes this even means your custom thing, right? I know a lot of companies will use their own YAML file format to define documentations or definitions and whatnot, right? You want to be able to integrate all that information into a metadata platform and then know to service it for your use cases. So ease of integration is a very key ingredient for a modern metadata platform. And that sort of boils down to, okay, how do you make sure as your API evolve, you have a way of evolving it without breaking your client, right? And then you also want to make sure that as you integrate, you have full visibility into what went wrong, right? Because a lot of time trying to figure that out is not an easy thing to do. And finally, okay, if something goes wrong, you want to be able to re-ingest all these metadata into your system once again, right? Because sometimes the metadata cannot be reproduced the second time. Right? Think of cases where the metadata was produced when the pipeline was run. And you cannot just say, oh, sorry, oops, I missed that metadata event. Can you rerun the pipeline again, right? The answer is no, right? Because that pipeline, if I rerun it, it's going to break other stuff. So how do you have a way of saying, hey, I have recourse, right? If for whatever reason that didn't work out the first time, I should have the ability to backfill those, whatever it's being initially transmitted in the first place. That's it for my presentation. So here's the plug. We're hiring. So we are SaaS vendors, so we're hiring mostly just sort of in this suite area. We front end, back end, full stack. We hire all of them. And as you can probably guess at this point, we are building a modern metadata platform. And if you're interested in that, I'm always happy to chat more. So you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Cool.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
There's a few people who had questions, so go for it.
Hey, Mars, maybe I can start. Hey, this is Jay. So yeah, I think you showed a very good picture of the overall ecosystem of the metadata and how it interacts and all that. So do you plan to build all of the aspects as part of the metaphor, or you focus on centralized platform that can empower various functionalities of the metadata?
It's definitely closer to the latter. In our opinion, we want to build the best platform, right? And then that's where those pieces come in, right? Ease of integration and whatnot. And the reason behind that is we're not building all the integration. Right? We won't be able to integrate with everything going out there or build all of that, ourselves. So a big part of it is to make sure that, hey, even if there's some proprietary system that you write, or some system that we do not, our customer don't use, you should be able to easily integrate that into the system as well. And so, yeah, I mean, there's certain part of the way we feel like in order to give a good experience, we will have to build it. For example, the data catalog side of the story, we feel like that's kind of an entryway into the system. And that is certainly something that we would love to build. But then once again, to us, we think of this as a platform that we're building rather than, all these use cases as a well-integrated system that we give to our customer, but more like how do we bring this to our customer and make sure that they can integrate it to us.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Fitz has a question in the chat here. He asks, do you see there being a place for kind of the data mesh approach governance of the nitty-gritty detailed data being in the domain of the specific data producer rather than the centralized governance group?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a lot of overlap between, what we're trying to do and data mesh as in general, or metadata platform and data mesh in general. The way we look at it is, first of all, it is a trend that sort of a lot of companies trying to move towards, but I don't think people will move overnight, right? I think it's not something that's easily doable. You kind of need to have certain data maturity and size, for that matter, to really adopt data mesh. And that's assumed you do, right? You're a big enterprise, you have thousands of people working on this, several groups, a business unit and whatnot. One of the key thing here with data mesh is you need to have this ability to define, your interface, so to speak, right? And then have that interface exposed in a way that other people can consume your data product, so to speak. So most certainly when that happens, the data producer in that case, the data product builder or data producer in that case, would definitely want to be able to expose that in a way that both human can consume as well as the system can consume as well. Right? And then once again, we do feel like that's where the metadata platform will come into play. And when that happens, oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it should be a complete distributed approach rather than some central group controlling this, right? Once again, we do feel like, if the data democratization trend is here to stay, that is the way everybody's going to move. Right? Eventually, there will be no one in the company that will have knowledge about everything in the every data assets in the company. That's intentional as well, right? There shouldn't be someone who has that entire knowledge in their head. So because of that, then it has to be a distributed nature, right? But once again, at the top level, someone needs to drive that initiative and say, look, this is how we're going to define the role looks like, right? So, whether that means, okay, I'm going to delegate that responsibility to these individual group and have them to implement it or not, they still kind of need that sort of top-down approach where people say, look, there's some basic rule, ground rule we're going to lay down there, right? And then that could mean say, hey, look, we all need to align to this particular system in order to expose these, SPAC and whatnot you define. I don't know if that answers your question. But, yeah.
You gave a thumbs up.
Awesome.
My question is, when you have a metadata platform and you have extensibility, either it sounds like you are being prescriptive about the kinds of metadata that you're storing in the platform, but you're extending it to an extent. At some point, you are giving someone a database. And where would you draw that line of like, okay, this is no longer a metadata platform, this is just a database that you can extend into anything?
You're asking a very good question there, right? So if you think about it, you're absolutely right about, how much how prescriptive do you want to be for your platform, right? On the extreme, once again, I tend to like to take things to both extreme and then sort of try to compromise in the middle, where I think normally that's where the best solution is, right? On the one extreme, you can have say, hey, look, I'm just a key value store, right? Store whatever you want, right? But then that would be a terrible service to use, right? Why would I want to use a service like that? I might as well just use a key value store in the first place. That's kind of a pure database approach, which is saying that, hey, look, I'm super flexible, do whatever you want, but ultimately you have to build everything yourself. And then the other extreme is kind of what I mentioned before, right? You can obviously have API that is zero extensibility, or bare minimum extensibility, sticking key value into fields and all that, right? We think the best platforms will sort of stay in the middle, right? You want to be able to have certain prescribed things, right? For example, people kind of have to agree on certain things to even make it work, right? Okay, you have to say what is, some global identifier to identify certain things, right? If you can't even agree on that, and then there's nothing to talk about at that point.
Yeah, certain forms really do need to match. Like lineage should not be a cyclical thing, kind of. Yeah.
Exactly, right. There's some basic rule you have to put in place, but then at the same time, you want to allow a lot of rich metadata to be append to it, right? And then these rich metadata, you really shouldn't have any control over them, because that's what makes it extensible. But then at the same time, you don't just throw them back as, essentially JSON blob and say, oh, go and interpret it, right? So the way we look at it is we need to have a language kind of to define the data model. And then through that language, you can generate a bunch of stuff, including the API, right? Including database schema and whatnot. So that way, for someone to add something, the cost of doing that is very low. You just have to write the data model. And then boom, everything else is automatically updated and generated. So that's the way we're looking at it right now, and that's the way we're trying to approach it as well. It's a hard problem, but I think we are onto that. We're making some good progress in that direction. So hopefully we can reach our ultimate goal, where people just have to write DSL at the end of the day, and everything else is all the magic at that point.
Nice. Yes. Very thought-provoking answer. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm pleasantly surprised that your presentation was only true concepts and not just slamming us with the product itself. But I'm looking at your website, I think, metaphor.io, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not seeing any like documentation or tutorial. Do you have anything like that yet?
Yeah, we do actually have, there's some certain documentation and stuff that's sort of in the works. We actually have an open source GitHub repository that we're not pushing for right now, because we're working with our customer closely on that. So whenever our customer work with us on board, we'll give them those documentation on that. Right now, it's not completely fully baked at this point, so that's why we're not quite ready to just open it up to everyone yet. But that is the approach that we're taking right now. But yeah, absolutely. If if people are interested, definitely talk to me. I'm happy to share more information on that front.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else have questions?
I do. I have another one.
Oh.
A fellow GraphQL person, I find that it's a lot harder for some people to kind of grok as a client. That might just because it's not like well received in the industry. Do you find that that's a blocker for your customers, or do you find that it really adds enough value that they get over that hurdle?
So I just want to make sure I set the record straight, right? We do want to support REST, right? That is still kind of the industry standard. And then I think most people feel very, very comfortable to file HTTP requests and then get response and move on with their life, right? GraphQL, on the other hand, I think it is still kind of a thing that is being maturing, right? I mean, obviously in the sort of the client front end industry, it's already very well adopted. I think on the sort of the backend side, where service and all that, that there's still a lot to be done there. So I think that is definitely not something that we hear a lot of people feel super excited about. most people, most of the customer workers, they still kind of prefer the REST approach. But like I said, as the use case get evolved over time, when you really need to write some sort of graph-oriented information, and you're trying to get a bunch of, think of it as, if you, a good way to think about this is, REST ultimately, most of the time, a REST call sort of boils down to getting some table, or maybe a small number of tables joined together as a result from the database. GraphQL actually allows you to really traverse your entire database in many different ways, and sort of recursively as well if needed. And that is a lot more powerful, right? So think of it as people, when they first learn SQL, they learn select, and then they learn join the two things, and then they get very fancy, the SQL grow into a 1,000-line monster, right? We do see that progression where people say, hey, look, my use case is very simple, just do the simple select statement for me, right? But then there will be use cases where they say, oh, sorry, I really need to write something very complicated. And that's when, yeah, the price of learning GraphQL will come into, there would be something that's probably a lot more justifiable.
Well said, thank you.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like we're kind of in data governance 2.0 or something right now. And there's a democratization movement going on where a lot of these tools, I think, that were reserved for large enterprises are now, they're available as open source projects. More of an organizational question, like it's kind of threefold or twofold. What type of company, I guess, is a good candidate for data governance? And then two, what are some ways that you've seen data governance successfully get adopted within companies if they're ready for it?
Yeah, so let me try to answer probably the second part, but back to the original thing you mentioned about data governance 2.0, right? We definitely talked to a lot of big banks out there and big insurance companies out there, where they start realizing whatever they adopt previously with data governance is not scaling or working, right? Especially for the more forward-thinking sort of company, right? Maybe more towards fintech-ish sort of company, right? They realize that, data is no longer something that help, them to run the business. It's actually something that they can actually, turn into products or even turn into business lines and whatnot, right? And then they realize they actually have a lot of data in a lot of silo. And then a lot of that was by design, essentially, right? They want to make sure that people don't have access across business groups, boundaries and whatnot. But that ultimately lead to this tedious things that they have. Essentially, they have, we have 3 data warehouses, or, we like hybrid, some are on-prem and some in the clouds and all that. So that's where the whole data governance 2.0 sort of movement come from, right? These companies actually also realize the same thing as well. They realize, it is no longer something that we can just put like 10 people in a team and say, hey, you guys take care of it for the whole bank, right? It has to be bottom up in that sense, because those people really have no clue at all what's happening, right? In there, right? So a lot of those traditional data governance solutions start breaking down in that sense, right? Because those things, like, they're designed for a complete central control sort of oriented way, right? And then when you actually hand those tools to the people who are doing the work, their scientists say, hey, why don't you use that? And they're like, what the hell is this thing? I don't know how to use it. Right? It doesn't even make that correct linkage, right? So I think, but then that's on the one extreme where, big traditional enterprises, they start realizing, and then that's kind of pleasantly surprised to us, because we thought the thinking might be still very, traditional in that sense. They were like, oh, no, we use, these 3 products and that's it, right? No, they're actually realizing the problem is they have to take it on this bottom-up approach, right? And that's why they're chatting with us even at this stage. On the other extreme, smaller company, obviously the smallest of the small company, right, where you have 2-person data team sort of company, they don't care about data governance. Let's face it, right? And then they're like, I'm small enough, right? I'm not gonna have any compliance issue, to be honest, right? For foreseeable future. So those companies don't care so much about, hey, I want to, comply with regulatory requirements and whatnot. The risk of that is very low. So the data governance was actually being told more as a productivity thing to them, right? They will not, adopt all the data governance principle, right? they'll probably be very selective about it, right? For example, the knowledge part of it, that applies to any sort of respectable size company, right? I mean, even if you have a team of 5 or 10 working on data, that's generally where you start seeing these problems of, oh, oops, the person who knew this left the company, right? Or I don't know, I did this 6 months ago, I don't know what I did there. So they definitely, sort of more focusing on these part of the data governance. But yeah, I think, obviously the smallest of the small don't care at all. But it's no longer a pure big company problem. I think, medium, sort of mid-sized company already start realizing that, because of this whole modern data stack that we start taking on, that leads to all these decentralized problems that we need to have some solution to solve as well. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, the thing I'm struggling with is like, there's a lot of these new tools. I wouldn't say it's new in the sense where these are old practices, but it's new approaches, kind of bringing this stuff to the masses. But the issue is like, how do you make it feel like it isn't like more work for somebody to do, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, now I have to do data governance. Great, I'm busy enough in my day job.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and that's I've sort of touched on in my presentation as well, right? For example, the whole knowledge stuff cannot be an afterthought. It cannot be like, oh, I need to go and do these extra things after I've done my work. It has to be part of it, right? And then even like the ownership stuff should also be the same, right? It should not be like, oh, I need to manually put in my name there so I become an owner, right? It should be just natural, right? As you do things, it just appear as such, right? So those are the things that it might be more like a product thing, right? How do you think about your product rather than technology per se? But those things make or break, right? Because if you don't have a good product, nobody want to use it. If you have a product that is very cumbersome, nobody want to use it. So ultimately, still kind of boils down to that as well. How do you make sure that people feel like, oh, it's not extra work for me? It will be more like, oh, that's naturally how it is, right? I don't think anyone will say, oh, replying in chat is an extra work for me. Right? It's like, that's part of your work already, right? So once it's in that sort of integration level where it's like, oh, it's natural, you don't feel like it's extra work, then that's much easier to have people to adopt to it.
Good point. Matthew Jeffs, you're raising your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. And I guess it's kind of like maybe going off a little bit of the line of thought that's been brought up already. I think the question was kind of like, at what point, does a company, have interest saying like, oh, we need to pick up data governance? Like how big is the company? And so I guess I wanted to see if I could get a little bit more clarification from you. I mean, immediately when I think about it, I'm like, okay, maybe there's a certain amount of employees that a company has where you're like, okay, that's a big enough company where, they probably are actively looking at data governance. It's ideally you would like to make sure they're educated and saying that's something that should be kind of built from the ground up. But, at some point, I guess, in their, data learning life cycle, they do come up with that. So I would say, like, at what point in, their data journey are you guys finding that they kind of start coming to you, if that makes sense, and saying, hey, we need to look at this?
No, that's an excellent question. And there's many sort of rough proxy indicator, right? I think company size is one of those. Right? It depends on industry, right? I mean, there's definitely a company as small as a couple hundred people coming talk to us, and then the company that are very large will say, oh, I don't care. But I think it depends on a lot about how much are they using their data, right? And then obviously that's sort of their bias towards certain industry, right? I mean, the more tech-oriented industry tend to use more data. So they tend to have these problems early on. So definitely the data maturity side of the story. But there's also another good indicator that we're seeing is the size of the data team, the core data team, versus the rest of the people who uses the data, right? So if you have a very small data team, but then you have to serve a lot of people, right? These people are all your stakeholder consumers and whatnot. Then that is when they start looking for tools to help them, right? Because if you think about data governance, it's like this thing that helps company to somehow a small group of people is able to help everybody, set everybody straight, right, so to speak. that's the tool that they need, right? Essentially, then so if you, even if the company is small, but if the data team is small, very small, and then somehow they have to serve the rest of the company, then that sort of thing come in a lot earlier. But like I said, once again, data governance has so many aspects of it. Most of these early adopters, right, smaller companies, team tend to take, for example, search and discovery. That's kind of the first order of problem, right? And then maybe they start getting to, knowledge, documentation, definition sort of area. And then maybe eventually they move into, okay, quality, compliance, and all these other areas. So there's definitely several level of progression that they go through this. But the first order problem generally surface as soon as you have this, ratio of imbalance, right? You have a small team that need to support a lot of people. That's a very good indicator.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate you expounding on that.
Sure.
Any other questions? Awesome. Well, I'll stop recording. Mars, as always, thanks. It's great to see you. Great presentation.
Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun. I hope this is a topic that people care about as much as we do, and we're happy to know that. So.
Sure. Yeah, I think you can see the rise of this, a lot more interest in this stuff over the next, from now into the future. It seems to be top of mind for everybody. So it's awesome. Cool. I'll stop recording and I'll leave it open to chat. So thanks, everybody.